Growing up, they didn't have the hijab, but when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, a few years later, a lot of the preachers started coming to Tanzania, and the hijab started becoming a part of the uniform. And it all just started, all those pieces started coming together on like why we loved, Khomeini and why we loved the Islamic Republic. Just growing up, there was this innate need to not be your own ethnicity, but you love Iranians. Or when you go to Iran, it was just like you felt so privileged that you would learn their language. And I'm like, but it's not our language. And Arabic, of course. But, they would have special schools set up in Iran for religious classes that people would send their kids to, just to like re-educate them, or like a substitution for Western educated colleges, etc. So that connection with Iran was also one of the most defining points that occurred to me after I left. I was like, why did we love Iran? Or like, why did I think that all Iranians they love their religion? Because that's what I was told. And I'd never seen a woman who was a Muslim from my community who hadn't worn a hijab and was considered good, or like, a good woman. It was always like, like she's going to go to hell. There were a few women, but I think it was when I went abroad that I actually saw a woman praying, but entering the prayer mosque or the prayer area without a hijab, putting on her hijab. And I was like, oh my God, you can be a good Muslim who prays and doesn't wear a hijab? As a 16-year-old, that was really mind-blowing. But I think it was also the time when I was exploring different things.
Right. So you had mentioned that the good and the bad, kind of the us versus them, or even just within the community, there are people who you would other, or this superiority complex that we see a lot in high control groups, where the ones who are following it the most devoutly feel like they're better than the people who aren't, or they're scared for them because they know that they're going to go to hell, at least in their mind. So I'm curious, within this specific group, because it was so strict, what were some of the things that you in your young child mind knew that if you did, that you would be going to hell if you were to die?
Showing my hair. Showing my hair was one. It was also, I wasn't a devout prayer, but my dad would always remind me, like, you need to pray. Talking to boys, showing my hair. What else was it? There were lots of things. Listening to music. There was a period where I just stopped listening to music because I want to be more religious, so I'm not going to listen to any music. And drawing. I know you did a podcast with Doodle, so she must have explained drawing. But the drawing part was very interesting because when I was, before I turned 8 or 9, I had never really heard about it from my community, from my parents, about you can't draw because it's not allowed. It was the people around me that told me that. So there was a lot of coercion happening outside the family, but around the people. So my family was very attuned to really pleasing other people. Like, what will people say? This is how you need to behave. And for the longest time, even after I left Tanzania, that was exactly some of the questions that came up. I think some of the memories I might have actually forgotten because I feel like I just moved past it. But I remember one of them was every Saturday we went to Islamic school, like from the community, like specific Islamic school. You learn about battles and like you learn to read Arabic. You learn Arabic and then you learn to read the Quran as well. And that was like every Saturday. And my dad focused more on the Saturday school than like my academics, but I was more interested on the academics. And I remember being dragged to the school. But there were times when every morning they would teach us how to pray in your young mind. You're like maybe 7 or even younger. You start when you're like 5 and you start going, and they would teach us how to recite dua, which is like a prayer, and they'd always say you need to keep your hands together and not apart because your prayers fall when your hands are apart. That was very hilarious now that I think about it, because I was like, it has to be like this and it has to be cupped. And those little innocent thoughts on like, how exactly do your how exactly should your feet be, or your toes be, or your forehead, on like really strict on like, this is the proper way of praying. And now as I'm talking to you about it, I'm like, surely, like, if I was a Muslim, God would know that if my palms are like this or straight, it really wouldn't matter. Everybody had a place, like, put people in line again on the Saturday school, because now this is our community. It's not just like people. It's not just the academic school where there are non-Muslims. This is the community, the same religious sect and its teachings, and as part of you doing your year 11 or year 12, I think, you had to teach the lower classes. So you're a substitute teacher. So I was technically teaching Islamic studies to the lower grades as well. And that was just something you do as you pass by, because nobody gets paid to teach. And so you do it as a volunteer thing, and that's how you graduate. Funny story, I never graduated because I hated Arabic and I did not want to do more Arabic classes. And I was like, I'm done. Like, it doesn't really matter. I got my academics. I'm like, still did everything, but I just didn't find Arabic to be pleasing, because you were forced to learn something that nobody would talk to you in that language. So it wasn't my language. We would speak Gujarati at home. We would speak Kutchi, which is like my parents' different languages. And my dad was mostly speaking Swahili. And I was raised speaking English as well. So English was my primary language, and all others were like, it's like a mashup of different languages that you would talk. And funny enough, I retained a lot of Arabic without actually wanting to do the exam, because I hated being marked on something I didn't want to do.
Wow, that's a lot of languages to know. And I can imagine that would feel kind of pointless, especially if you're not very invested in the doctrine, which is what I was going to ask you, was how much did you believe it? How much did you internalize it? How much did you want to follow the rules because you were afraid of hell or afraid of the shame?
When I was young, probably a bit more, probably more than when I left home. Because my dad was such an integral part at the time of the community, there were a lot of eyes on me and my sisters. We were 5 girls, and my brother as well. There were a lot of eyes on us, and that's why there was a lot of pressure to do it. But personally, for me, it was always like a dip of up and down. Sometimes I'd wake up to pray, sometimes I wouldn't. My dad would try, and I'm like, you know what, you cannot. I would reverse Uno him, and I'm like, you cannot force people to pray. They have to pray on their own. I was a smart kid and rebellious. I used to reverse Uno him, and, he was never really abusive to me, except for the one time I didn't pray. It was like a butt kind of spank, and I was really shocked because he'd never done that to me before. And it was because I lied about praying, and that's what upset him, because I lied. And I was like, fair, but no. Based on that, the fear of letting down my family was more than the fear of hell. There were times when I feared hell, but I don't know if I can remember it as much anymore. I have this ability to just block out some of the past that weren't pleasant. I didn't go through anything as traumatic in my younger years, except for like patriarchal norms or conversations with my family, etc. There were elements where I was like, you said that and you did that to me, religious or not, just as a family member. And I'm like, I didn't like that and we should change that. Or I don't think you should continue doing that or talking to me that way and setting more boundaries now, which also means that's why I've forgotten a lot of that family dynamics that we had. So I don't know if I can remember a lot of it growing up on how religious I used to be. I used to wear a hijab full on, like properly. I even wanted to wear niqab.
Can you explain what that looks like for people who aren't familiar?
Yeah, so niqab is like the face covering, like and you just show your eyes. And I also wanted to wear gloves, so like no part of my body could be seen. There were times when I would go through this periods of like wanting to be religious because either my friends had done it or I was inspired by a female religious preachers. Actually, it was my mom who said, no, you're not wearing a niqab. Or even when I wanted to wear a hijab, she was the one who's like, are you sure you want to start wearing it? Because once you do, you cannot take it off. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure, because like, that's what all good girls do. Like all good Muslim women do that, so I have to do it. So there were elements that was like more about being in line and because that was required of me than hell.
Yeah, the social pressures and wanting to fit in and wanting to just feel accepted, I would say, is a very normal thing.
The way I saw hell was that everybody would eventually go to heaven. And if you do bad things, like literal bad things, maybe let's say not wearing a hijab, but actually like hurting somebody or punching somebody, you would go to hell for a time and then you'd go to heaven. And I think in my mind, I'd made up this safe place as a child, maybe, or just growing up, where the concept of hell in my mind was this is what happens. You know, you could be a disbeliever, maybe you'll go to hell for a bit, but I didn't believe in eternal hell because I think maybe it was too traumatic to get that in your mind.
Yeah, it seems like you just created a safety mechanism so you didn't have to imagine what it would be like to go to hell forever for doing something that you didn't deem as worthy of going to hell forever. So that makes sense, especially as a child.